by the Graduate Writing Center and also WeSay, Women in Science at Yale. So thank you all for coming, and thanks also to our panelists tonight. Preparing manuscripts, choosing where to submit them, and then also getting them accepted involve a number of important professional decisions. So the goal of this panel today is to unpack some of those decisions and also talk about the factors that might go into them. So we're grateful that you all came, both to hear and to speak today. And we'd also like to thank the Yale doctoral program in biophysics for funding our refreshments tonight. So to get started, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourself. If you tell us a little bit about your area of expertise, where you are in your career, and any other experience that's relevant to our subject tonight, that would be wonderful. And if you would like some magnification.
Okay. I'm not sure I need magnification. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. I'm Anjelica Gonzalez, and I'm assistant professor in Biomedical and Engineering department, and I have an association with the Vascular Biology and Therapeutics program in the medical school. So from just that general description of who I am, you can kind of get the idea that my research is focused on biomaterials and development of biomaterials for investigation of vascular processes, and specifically immunoregulation that relates to diseases like diabetes, disorders of wound healing, pulmonary inflammation. So it's kind of a broad application of biomaterials and vascular biology. And let's see. Experience as far as writing papers, I've published in a wide variety of journals because I like to expand. So I published in some very niche journals like Tissue Engineering, Leukocyte, Journal of Leukocyte Biology, to some more broad things like American Journal of Public Health and Nutrition. My publications have been highly scientific, and then I've done some other things where I'm talking about how to keep your passion for research alive, and other things like we were just talking about something I wrote that was called A Letter to My Younger Self. That's more of a motivational thing for young women who are interested in pursuing scientific careers. And then I've served on as a reviewer for journals that I published in, and then also broader journals, PNAS, biomaterials, things like that.
I'm Vivian Irish. You can hear me, right? So I'm a professor in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. I also have a joint appointment in ecology and evolutionary biology. And my interests in general are in developmental biology, both developmental genetic mechanisms as well as comparative biology. I've been here at Yale for 20 years, so I'm now a full professor. In terms of aspects of my career that are relevant to today's discussion, I am the editor of a journal. The journal's called Evolution and Development. I'm on the editorial board of a couple of different other journals. I've published in a lot of different journals over the years, both niche journals as well as more general interest journals. Published a variety of types of things, from reviews to opinion pieces to straight scientific research articles. I've reviewed lots of papers. I'm also president of the U.S. Society for Developmental Biology, and as part of that job, we oversee publications in the area. And one of the things we've been discussing actively in the society is starting a new journal, a new open access journal. So I know at least one of the things we'll probably talk about today are open access journals. So maybe we can touch on that later. Okay, I think that's my introduction, I guess.
Hello everyone, my name is Elsa Yan. I'm an associate professor at the chemistry department. So Yale has this funny thing, they promote you to associate without tenure, so I'm at that stage. So in 1 or 2 years I will go up for tenure. So my relevant experience is I've been publishing, and hopefully I will continue doing it. Aside from this, I also review papers, so that's my experience on the topic.
I'm Jo Handelsman. I'm a professor in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. I've been at Yale for 3 years, before which I was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 25 years. And I've been a department chair. I've reviewed a lot of tenure cases. I've been on a lot of search committees, which I think are some of the issues that may be relevant to this group in terms of publishing. So I've heard a lot of discussions of papers. I've also been editor-in-chief of one journal and an editor of a couple of others, and on a lot of editorial boards. I'm also president-elect of my professional society, which is the American Society for Microbiology, and we're also examining a lot of publication issues, particularly the snippiness of reviewers, which has become a very discouraging feature of publishing, and the ASM wants to do something about that, so we'll see if we do. It's a little hard to control reviewers, and these days you're grateful enough when somebody accepts a reviewing task that you don't really want to tell them not to be snippy. I'm a microbiologist, as you can probably gather from my affiliations, and I study small molecules in bacterial communities, and particularly antibiotics and signals and how they control what bacteria do with each other and in communities.
So to get us started, I wondered if you could tell us what kinds of things you look for in choosing a journal. What do you consider when you're looking at the fit of a manuscript to a particular publication?
Okay, I can start. It's really dependent in my field, in my research on what I'm trying to get across to the reader and who needs to see this. So right now, one of my graduate students is working on a paper that's describing the development of a model that can be broadly applied. So that needs to go somewhere where a lot of people are going to see it so that they can contact me about using this kind of model in different applications. But if I'm looking at something that's a very mechanistic description of a process that's very specific for a cell type or a combination of cells, then I'm probably going to shoot for a very niche journal, so something in my field like group biology or immunology versus Nature, Science, PNAS. So the way I've done it so far is based on what my goal is for getting the information out.
I think that's similar for me. I also find it's really useful to get feedback from colleagues who are not that close to my field, to read over a paper before I send it out, just to make sure that I've targeted the right audience appropriately. So if I want to send this to a general journal in particular, I really want to make sure I've written the paper appropriately for that general journal. I don't think any of these things are rocket science. But you do need to pitch your writing appropriately to the type of journal that you're targeting. So obviously we start with the kind of material you want to present, whether it's sort of of general interest or more specific interest, and then trying to tailor your writing to that audience appropriately.
My goal of choosing a journal mainly depends on which audience I want to reach. That is the key thing.
I would agree with everything that's been said and just emphasize what Valerie said about, I'm sorry, what Vivian said. How many times have I done that to you too? We have a Valerie and a Vivian in our department. I have trouble with these. I would just like to echo what she said about writing for a broad audience. I think one of the things I found that young scientists do the least well is reach an audience beyond their own lab. And I find it amazing how many pieces of jargon everyone thinks is so core to the world at large that everyone will understand their jargon. And I think you can never strip down the jargon enough, even for a specialized audience, because there may be people from other fields who are interested in your paper for reasons that you can't even anticipate. And if they can't penetrate the jargon and the acronyms and the gene names, they're probably not going to get as much out of it. And so I think the skill of writing in plain English that can be understood is one of the most important ones, and we frankly don't teach it very well. When Valerie, not Vivian, and I ran a seminar series given by graduate students, so this is one of my colleagues in MCDB, we asked the students to present a very, very broad introduction, because our department's very diverse, and you can't assume that people know why your work is important or why they should care. And I would say about 85% of the students did not do it, no matter how hard we stressed that it was the way we were going to be presenting seminars. Some of them tried and couldn't do it. Most of them didn't even try. Or what they considered to be broad and general was, you know, like the 5 people outside their lab most closely related to their work. So I think that you need to kind of think at the next level. If you think you're pitching it broadly, go a little broader, and you'll probably be more in the ballpark.
There's a question.
I guess along those lines, when you choose either a niche journal or a more general journal, do you also change the tone? In addition to just limiting jargon and trying to make it more approachable, do you also change the tone and make it either more loose and more approachable for a general audience or more discreet and specific for a niche audience?
I think that's very dependent on the journal, not even just the audience. I think you know, if it's a really tight, you know, small, short page number, short abstracts, so that you need to get the information out, the scientific information out in a really concise manner. So I think that kind of sometimes dictates that the tone is going to be very straightforward and very sciencey, as opposed to be something that a general audience can absorb really easily. I don't know.
Yeah, but along those lines, for a general journal, you really have to make sure that the take-home message is right there up front in the abstract. And people, this gets back to Joe's point, people think they've said that. And then you ask somebody to read that abstract and you say, but I don't really know what it is you're trying to show. And it's really hard to hit that right tone and pitch it appropriately so people can look at that, just that abstract, because that's really what people look at. You know, when you're just glossing through journals, that's what you look at. When they're looking for reviewers to review papers, the abstract pretty much is going to target where what reviewers are going to be picked for that paper. So you really want to get that up front and laid out as clearly and coherently and concisely as possible.
I agree that it really depends on the style of the journal. So you might want to flip through some paper published in that particular journal and see if you get some idea about the tone that you're talking about.
I think probably the biggest difference is not as much as tone, but the pitch, the hook that you're going to use. You know, if I were to write a paper for a microbiology journal and explained why bacteria are important and why their signals are critical to their lives, it would be kind of embarrassing. If I did that in a general science or PNAS type audience, it would be necessary. So I think it's sort of where you start in the specificity that's the biggest difference.
So one thing I wonder is when...
Andrea, can you speak up?
Yes.
Thanks.
One thing I wonder is when in the process of preparing, sort of designing an experiment, preparing a manuscript, and then analyzing your results, are you making these kinds of decisions? Where does that fall for you? I mean, it could differ for different majors, I imagine.
Well, I always start the project with a question or a hypothesis. So once I do collect enough data and I can address or answer the question or redefine the question, when I have a story, then I will make the decision based on the story.
Yeah, I think I do it somewhere in the middle. So when I first start a project, of course I have like an idea that I want to test out, a hypothesis that I'm trying to to test. And as soon as I start to get an idea of what the data is going to look like, I start drawing like a storyboard kind of thing. I don't have all of the data that I have in my mind how I'm going to set up these experiments. And so there, if I can think of enough, you know, really interesting, innovative approaches to how I want to address the problem, then I start thinking, oh, if this really works out, then this could be pretty high profile, or it can go, you know, to a broad audience because it has wide application. If I start doing experiments and they don't turn out exactly how I want them to, then I can start skewing that more towards, well, what are the deeper questions? So more of the niche questions. Am I looking more at an individual molecule, an agent molecule pathway kind of thing, as opposed to a broader storyline? So I make that decision, and it's a progressive decision as I work on that project.
Although sometimes it can work the opposite way, that if everything comes out the way you sort of hoped, it's a predictable story. I mean, it may be interesting and it may be important to have the information, but it also may be somewhat predictable. And it's the surprises very often where the biology or chemistry is not what you expected that sometimes can make you go for the higher profile journals. So I think the answer is it changes midstream a lot. I'll often think in my mind when I start a project, well, if it were to come out this way, it might be a very high profile journal, and if it comes out that way, then it'll be one of our mainstream specialty journals, and have kind of that double track in my mind, or even discussed with the co-authors at the beginning.
So I guess along those lines, there was...
So you're talking about profiling journals. Is there a measure for that other than the impact factor? What are all the considerations for that?
I read recently that impact factors are not considered as much as young people think they are. I thought I was just out of it because I don't look at impact factors very much, and all my students, that's the first thing they look up. And then I read this thing that said that, in fact, most people on search committees and evaluation committees don't care about impact factors that much. They really do care about the paper and the content. So I don't know where they got the data for that, but that was the argument. I think it's pretty obvious that if it's in Science or Nature or PNAS, a lot more people will see it just because of where it is. Once you're beyond that, and some people would argue Cell is in that group, one of my colleagues at Harvard calls it the Holy Trinity, and you can Science and Nature, and you can put in the third one however you want, either PNAS or Cell. And he argues, and he's one of the most illustrious scientists I know, he argues that that's just so overblown, and people are so obsessed with the Holy Trinity that they waste a lot of energy rewriting papers that they submit to the Holy Trinity and are disappointed. That's a position I think a lot of people will take, and today they'll say, well, with searches, the paper's going to turn up anyway. And I have heard that so many times recently from really senior people that I feel like I have to repeat it, but it does seem a little bit silly because everyone knows that people comb through Science and Nature in ways that they don't journals outside their field. I mean, you browse in the broad journals, and so you can reach a broader audience if you're in the highest profile journals. I think once you get below those 3 or 4 journals, it frankly doesn't matter that much because people find the papers if they're interesting, if they're cited, and if they're in a particular area with the keywords carefully chosen.
I'm actually going to argue with that
Okay,
point.
good. I was waiting. Somebody should.
I personally don't care too much about impact factors, but I've had a lot of students and postdocs from both Europe and Asia, and when they go off to get jobs in their home countries often, it matters a great deal. So I think it's both discipline specific, because I've sat on a lot of committees that are interdisciplinary, and different disciplines treat impact factors differently. I think engineering actually, well, you can answer that, but I think engineering disciplines really look at that. countries, specific countries look at impact factors. If you're in the US doing biology, I totally agree with you. I don't think it's that big a deal. But that's not the whole
I agree.
world.
That's a good distinction. And in China, I think raises are tied and promotions are tied to the impact factor of the journal. So yeah, that was a very US-centric comment I made.
So in fact, I do consider impact factors in the sense that when I'm publishing a paper with a student or postdoc, I have to be aware of the fact that they're Belgian or they're French or something, and they may want to go back to their home country, and that's going to have a big impact on their future. So I do pay some attention to it from that point of view. I think there's a question.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up question to that. When we are moving on and applying for future positions, and we're presenting a potential employer with a CV, I mean, from your position, as you glance through that CV and you look at those journals that we published in, does that factor into how you judge our application, how you judge the profile of our work and such?
It certainly plays into it.
As a matter of fact, this afternoon I went to a faculty meeting. And in our faculty meeting, we picked candidate to interview this year. So people need to make summary about the people they choose, right? So they would say, oh, this person has 2 science paper, 3 nature paper. So it came to discussion. This is fact. But maybe it's just the top, like nature, science, PNAS, that matter.
The reason I think those are so important is that people outside your field think it must be important if it got into those journals. And we all know that there's plenty of awful work in Science and Nature, and there's great work that doesn't get into Science and Nature. But in general, things have to be well-written and interesting to a broad audience and fairly important to be in those journals. So if you can't judge the work for yourself, which is often the case when you're on a search committee or even a promotion committee, that's a shorthand. And that's why I think those particular journals are so powerful, because that's what people look for if they can't make their own judgment.
I think that holds true for not just hiring, but also grants, sitting on review panels, and inviting people for talks, those kind of things, because you recognize that again, if you're reviewing that grant, you may not be the expert in whatever they're proposing to do, but you hope that whoever reviewed the papers and admitted them into science or accepted them into Science and Nature, those were the experts in that field. So you kind of give them that kind of the extra points. So I think, in my experience, it has mattered to some extent. A good thing. Question.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, I definitely see, when it's been said, oh, that person has this many Science or Nature papers. I've certainly heard that before. But within a field, it still seems like there are tiers of journals, and surely that could cause an impact to a hiring manager as well, more than just the big 3. In chemistry, certainly we have JACs, and then we have oh, well, that'll be an inorganic chemistry paper, right? So, I mean, it is bigger, I guess, isn't it? We really do have to be kind of thinking about the tiers. I guess that's a comment more than a question.
In chemistry,
I guess my question was it is then,
true, right?
do you guys feel that as much as we feel that?
I think it's more true in chemistry. That's my understanding.
I would say, so let's say we focus on choosing candidate for interview. So you need to read 40 applications, right? So you flip through your CV and everything. So what catch your eyes, right? Inorganic chemistry or JACs? And you tell me. So yeah, unless the committee actually know the person or know their advisor, then they know what this candidate actually are doing. But if you ask that committee member to actually dig out the paper and read through and see what's the content of it, it's not actually practical.
So I'd actually like to ask you how the open access policy of a journal impacts your So how does the open access policy of a journal impact your decision about whether to submit there or not? What is your thinking around that? And perhaps you, Dr. Parrish.
Well, I still have mixed feelings about open access, I guess is how I'll preface this. I think there's some really great journals that have now become established as open access journals. That being said, there's an awful lot of, I think the term being used now are predatory journals, if you've seen that term or heard that term, which are basically vanity press journals where you just, pay X amount and they'll publish your article. They claim it's reviewed, but it's essentially not reviewed. And there's a lot of startup journals like that where they're basically functioning as a website to get your author fees and then publish your paper without any real critical review. And it's, the field is evolving now. It's hard to necessarily weed those out. If you look at a whole bunch of journals, you may not know which one is sort of a quote-unquote peer-reviewed but not really peer-reviewed journal versus a bona fide open access journal that has a serious peer-reviewed process. So that's one of the issues with open access right now. Open access journals tend to be more expensive to publish in because you're not going through the whole journal process. You're basically paying up front for all of that help. So I guess I have to say I have some mixed feelings about it. That being said, I'm about probably next week to submit my first paper to an open access journal, so I'm going to take the plunge. But maybe you guys have other opinions.
So I'm pretty still new with that part. I'm a little, so I think once, and you probably are receiving all these emails from OMCIS and all those kind of publishing companies that you can call them that. So I'm still trying to figure out who is predatory and who's real, and the way I deal with it is I look at it and I see if it's something. First of all, if it's the title of the journal is even relevant to my work, and then I contact somebody else who may have published there or somebody who I respect in the field, one of my mentors, and say, do you know anything about this journal? Would it be worth sending something to? Because I'm still filling this whole part of this process out. And it's scary because I would hate to submit something that a student or I have worked on for so long to something that's not going to count towards anything on my CV when somebody else reviews it. So I'm trying to be very careful about that. And the safest way to go to me is publishing in something that I already know and something that I read myself and am comfortable with.
Yes, I usually consider the journal I actually read. And so far, I don't follow any open access journal in chemistry, so I basically don't consider.
I believe in the principles of open access, but I think, as Vivian said, there are all sorts of specifics that get in the way, and the expense is one of them. And they're exorbitant to publish in, because somebody has to pay the cost of publishing, and it's just through the open access, it's just transferred to the authors. And I had mixed feelings about that, although the idea of making publicly funded research available publicly to everybody, I think, is really wonderful. We're supposed to produce and disseminate knowledge, so it's a good way to disseminate.
So going on from some of those points, how do you feel about publishing in a journal like PLOS One? If you're familiar with that one, is that a good idea where it's peer reviewed, but they're not necessarily going to assess like the scientific merit to the same extent?
Yeah, I've lost my train of thought here. Sorry, somebody else want to jump in? I wanted to respond to something Joseph. I need to think this through.
That one, I have just limited experience in that. I have friends who have published in there, and the best part about that is that they get their papers out, and there's wide readership of that. And I haven't heard as much negative feedback from senior faculty about what they thought about those papers that were published in there. So if there were one that I were going to look into publishing in seriously, then that would probably be also would be where I'd go. But I really don't have enough, a large enough sample size to know that it would really matter on my CV in a positive way, or whether it would hurt.
Yeah, I guess where you all read your paper, the papers that you read are a good indicator of where you should be publishing, right? So if you're reading Class 1 papers and getting something out of them, something worthwhile, then that's a good indicator right then. And, actually, I do remember now what I was going to respond to, or follow up on something Joe said with regard to open access. So if you're publishing work and it's been federally funded, by some U.S. agency, you're required to make, that information is required to be publicly available. So all journals now, both open access as well as your traditional paper journals, have to make that information freely available. And so the way most journals handle this is that they have a moratorium on disseminating this information freely until 6 months or a year after publication. So you can see the abstract, but you can't see the rest of the paper unless you subscribe to that journal for a certain period of time. But it's not that you can never get that information. So that information does become available to everybody eventually.
So you have a diversity of sort of career stages, and I was just wondering if your decisions about where to publish and with whom to publish change over the course of your career.
So I haven't changed that much. Pretty early at this. But I imagine that impact factor will matter maybe less as I go on. So right now I'm trying to get my name noticed. I'm trying to get the research, get my name associated with a niche of research. So the only way to do that is publish in high impact or present to large audiences. So I think I hope that it will matter less as I go on, but I don't know.
I guess it has changed a little bit for me. I mean, sort of the bell curve has shifted slightly. I mean, the distribution is still very similar, but when I was at your stage, that was the criteria you mentioned were very important to me. Now that I'm an old fogey and et cetera.
Wise, she's just wise.
I look more towards publishing in journals that I think will enhance the field in a sense, that I can sort of help promote a journal or an area by where I publish, or people in my lab. Think about what would really best fit them in terms of a journal, not so much what's going to add to my CV and promote it, but thinking a little bit more about the field more broadly.
What I can say is I want to get to that stage.
I think as you get more senior, you're more focused on big stories or higher impact. And I think when you're more junior, numbers really do matter. You get your name out there more often, you have more lines in your CV. As much as I hate to say it out loud, people can count even if they can't read. And so people will often publish smaller, not minimal units, but certainly smaller stories and pieces. And I think you have to show progress on your grants and get to whatever your next stage is. When you get older, you kind of want to save it up for the big story that will be high impact, that will be, the classic of the field, that may be your dream, whether you realize it or not. That's sort of the goal. And I think that becomes a little bit more in conflict with your students and postdocs then. And they have to be the first concern. But of course, you know that for them as well, if you have that high impact paper, that would be great for them. But on the other hand, if it doesn't happen, they need the incremental pieces published for their purposes as well. So you have to balance your own goals and dreams and values with what the people who publish with you need.
I guess I was just wondering how that affects a graduate student's career. Like, let's say you have a graduate student who's applying for a postdoctoral position with one of you. And say this graduate student has worked for like a faculty member who's in the startup phase where they're pushing for a lot of publications, and so they get a lot more of the smaller publications. Does that look better to have more publications than it would from somebody who like maybe is coming from a more senior faculty member, but they don't have very many publications because that faculty member really wants to get a whole story, and so they do less work. So I guess I was just wondering how much the number matters for a graduate student applying for another position.
In the scenario you present, I think it's clear that you might go for the senior student who work with the senior person, because there was the implication that there was a smaller number of papers, but they were bigger or more important discoveries. And I think you want people who make big discoveries and know how to present them as big discoveries. And there is an art to writing the big discovery paper as opposed to the incremental one. But it's never quite that stark. Usually it's a mixture, and if it's a postdoc, for example, usually you know their field, unless they're totally switching fields. You know their fields well enough to be able to make your own judgment. Is it a long string of trivial papers, or are there a couple of really important ones and then some less important ones in there? Those are really different scenarios.
In terms of moving on to the postdoc position, your publication list is important, but more important is the recommendation letter from your advisor, because we know you through your advisor's name and work, right? So it's extremely important you got good recommendation.
Thank you. So speaking of big stories, I would like to ask you a couple questions that come out of reading Dr. Handelsman's recent paper in PNAS showing some subtle gender bias among tenured faculty. And so in the context of a discussion of publishing, I wanted to ask you what you think about the practice of double-blind review, both as editors and also as authors, and also whether you would suggest that young female students, or even, well, we'll leave it there, female students, whether they should publish under first initials rather than using a full name.
Are you asking me? I have a lot to say on this subject, so why don't we hear from everyone else first? Okay, so has everyone seen the paper? Who's seen the paper? Okay, so the short version of the story is that there's a long history of research in social science and social psychology that shows that if people know that work is done by a woman, it will be valued less than if the same work is presented as done by a man. And if a man and a woman, or if you give people a CV of a person and ask if they would hire them, if it has a woman's name, the person is less likely to be hired. And that's particularly true and largely true in male-dominated fields, and in female-dominated fields like nursing, it actually goes the other way. So there's prejudice against men. And the evidence is that this is an unconscious process. This is not deliberate discrimination. It's not the kind of discrimination I think we've been working on for decades and done actually pretty well with. It's another process that men and women apply equally. Blacks and whites apply the racial version of it equally, and it's an unintentional process, and so people believe that they're a lot less prejudiced or biased than they are. So I have done a lot of training in diversity and women in science, and I've given talks on this whole area of unconscious bias repeatedly. And for about 10 years, every time I talked to a group of scientists, they would say, well, it may come out that way. For 40 years with hundreds of studies in every other field, but if you did it in science, it wouldn't come out that way because scientists are trained to be objective, and therefore we take the facts into account and we don't have biases. And what I've found is that scientists don't want to believe this. I mean, nobody wants to believe it. It's awful that, you know, you're discriminating when most people intend to be fair human beings. We all say we want to be fair. And to fall that short and find that out when you've been kind of doing this for a while is kind of bleak. So people will dismiss it on all sorts of grounds. Like when I was at Wisconsin, people said, oh, I'm sure they're like that at Harvard, but they're not like that at Wisconsin. I went to Harvard and did a training session for the deans at the request of Larry Summers, who was president then, and one of the deans, sure enough, said, well, of course, you're from Wisconsin, we're at Harvard, we don't. And then I came to Yale, and I was asked to run a diversity program for some senior faculty in the sciences, and it didn't take more than 20 minutes to hear, yeah, this is Yale, though, and we don't have sexism here. I kid you not. So, all of these dismissals are essentially impossible to address. But the one that I could not address was that scientists are less biased than other people. So finally, I have a postdoc in my group, my education research group, who is a social psychologist and did her PhD in unconscious bias. So I came back from one of these diversity fellows meetings and told her, you know, yet again, the comment about we're scientists, we don't do that, and we kind of looked at each other and said, well, the only answer here is to do the damn experiment. So we did it, and we sent a description of an undergraduate's career and accomplishments to faculty in biology, chemistry, and physics departments across 6 universities, top research universities, publics and privates. And we got 127 participants, and they answered our questions. And the bottom line is that if it had the name John on the description, they would be more likely to hire, more likely to mentor the student, more likely to say that he was competent, and pay him $30,000 when they would pay Jennifer $26,000. So, and everyone had one and the same description. So the only variable was gender here, and male and female faculty did exactly the same. I mean, it came out exactly the way every experiment that's been done like this in the social psychology field has come out, except I think the effect was a little stronger with scientists. And that's just my hunch. I don't have proof of that, but it looks that way. And there's actually a lot of research showing that people who think they're unbiased are the most likely to apply bias. And that's a very robust result. And so the people who think they're not sexist, think that they're not racist, are in practice and in action more likely to behave those ways. So it actually is reasonable to think that scientists are worse than everyone else because we think we're so unbiased. And so that's the sort of contradiction. Well, the paper has gotten a lot of coverage in the lay press and the scientific press, including the journal that rejected it because they said it wasn't of broad enough interest. And it's been a very interesting experience to discuss this with scientists and non-scientists and see how people interpret it. And the best part of it is that nobody tries to say scientists aren't biased as a result. And that moves the whole conversation to a different place, I think. And instead of discussing whether this is true of scientists, I think people accept now who have read the paper, or at least the ones I've talked to, believe that there is the potential for bias that comes from an unconscious, implicit, unintended place, and that we need to be considering that in the way that we judge people's work. So that leads to the question, what do you do about it? And blind review is certainly one of the answers. An ecology journal a few years ago did 6 months of blind review where the authors' names were blind. The reviewers' names have always been blind. And they saw about a 30% increase in the frequency of papers accepted by women, of papers authored by women. So that would indicate that that might be a reasonable way to go. Grants, it's very difficult to do because you're in part evaluating the progress and the accomplishments of the person who is applying for the grant, so their identity at some level has to be known, and it's very hard to hide your identity when someone, you know, is presenting the detailed work that you have to present in a grant. Most of us could probably guess pretty well. So I think that's more problematic, but I think for